the flight encounter, a sky of quiet tension. The hum of jet engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats aboard the transatlantic flight. It was one of those rare, quiet evenings in first class, where the soft clinking of glasses and the shuffle of attendants brought a calm that almost felt rehearsed. The leather seats stretched comfortably, blankets folded neatly, and champagne sparkled in crystal flutes. Among the passengers was Daniel Mercer, a 42-year-old businessman whose presence was as loud as the watch strapped to his wrist. Daniel had spent years climbing the corporate ladder in New York, fueled by ambition, pride, and an obsession with appearances. To him, success wasn't measured by inner peace or kindness, but by the weight of his bank account and the envy he could provoke in others. Daniel had boarded the flight already irritated. The deal he had worked on for months had fallen apart at the last minute. His rivals gloated, his investors doubted, and his pride stung like a fresh wound. To top it off, the airline had made a mistake with his preferred seat arrangement, something he considered unacceptable. He sat down with a scowl, his expensive suit pressed perfectly, his cufflinks gleaming, but his heart heavy with resentment. An unexpected neighbor as Daniel adjusted his tie. Someone quietly slipped into the seat beside him. No entourage, no loud announcement, just a tall, lean man with dark hair and a humble smile. He wore simple clothes. Jeans, a plain black shirt, and worn boots that looked far from the polished shoes Daniel expected in this section of the plane. The man placed his small bag in the overhead compartment without fuss, then settled gracefully into his seat. Daniel noticed him, frowned, and muttered under his breath, "First class isn't what it used to be." The man glanced at him briefly, offering a polite nod but said nothing. His eyes carried a depth that seemed both distant and kind, as though he had lived through storms Daniel couldn't even imagine. It wasn't until a flight attendant whispered, "It's such an honor to have you on board," that Daniel realized who sat beside him. It was Keanu Reeves. The first insult, Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "Of course, another actor living off fame, pretending to be one of us. You people think you're philosophers because you play pretend on camera." The words cut the air sharper than Daniel realized. He expected Keanu to defend himself, to put him in his place, maybe even call a flight attendant to complain. Instead, Keanu simply smiled faintly and replied, "I'm just a passenger like you, sir." Nothing more. Daniel wasn't satisfied. His pride, already wounded from his failed deal, needed fuel. "Come on, don't play humble with me. I know your type. You sit here thinking you're better than everyone else because the world worships you. But let's be honest, without the cameras, without the fans, you're nothing special." Passengers nearby grew uncomfortable, stealing glances while pretending to adjust their seatbelts or read magazines. The flight attendants froze for a moment, unsure whether to intervene. Keanu, however, remained calm. His posture relaxed, his voice steady. "Maybe that's true," he said softly. "Without the cameras, I'm just a man. But aren't we all?" A battle of egos Daniel wasn't ready to let go. His anger wasn't about Keanu. It was about himself, his failures, his unresolved wounds. Keanu's humility only irritated him more, like salt on a wound. "Don't give me that Zen nonsense," Daniel snapped. "You've had everything handed to you. Fame, money, fans who worship the ground you walk on. Do you even know what real struggle looks like? Have you ever built something from scratch, fought for every inch, clawed your way up without anyone knowing your name?" Keanu turned to face him fully now. His eyes, gentle yet piercing, held Daniel's gaze. "You'd be surprised at the battles people carry quietly. Not every scar is visible, Daniel." The businessman blinked. Keanu knew his name. He hadn't introduced himself. Confused, Daniel laughed harshly. "Of course you know my name. You actors always get a passenger list. Part of the pampering, I suppose." But deep down, something in Keanu's tone unsettled him. A flight of reflection. The hours stretched on. Dinner was served, and while Daniel devoured his steak with hurried bites, Keanu ate slowly, almost reverently, as though each bite was an opportunity to savor life itself. When Daniel complained about the wine not being aged enough, Keanu simply thanked the attendant for the meal. At one point, turbulence shook the plane. Daniel cursed under his breath, clutching his armrest tightly. Keanu, in contrast, closed his eyes and breathed calmly, as though the chaos outside couldn't touch the peace within him. "Why aren't you worried?" Daniel asked, annoyed by Keanu's composure. "Worry doesn't stop the storm," Keanu replied, "but peace can carry you through it." Daniel rolled his eyes, muttering something about fortune cookie wisdom. But secretly, he envied the calmness beside him, the seed of curiosity as the flight continued. Daniel tried to distract himself with business reports, luxury magazines, and his phone. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward Keanu, who was reading a worn-out paperback. Not a tablet, not a glossy bestseller, just a simple book with creased pages and faded ink. "What are you reading?" Daniel finally asked, unable to suppress his curiosity. Keanu looked up and smiled. "It's a book about resilience, about how people find meaning through suffering." Daniel snorted. "Meaning through suffering? That's rich. Pain is just pain. Nothing more. Trust me, I've lived it." Keanu's smile didn't fade. "Then maybe you've already walked the road the book is about." Those words lingered, echoing louder than Daniel wanted to admit. For the first time in years, he felt as though someone saw through his carefully built armor. The insult that backfired. Near the end of the flight, Daniel, still unwilling to surrender, leaned closer and whispered harshly, "You know what, Reeves? People worship you, but in reality, you're just a sad man who pretends to be a hero on screen. I bet when the cameras are off, you're as lost as the rest of us, maybe worse." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Keanu looked at him, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with compassion so deep it unsettled Daniel more than any insult could have. "You're right," Keanu said gently. "I'm lost sometimes. I've known loss, pain, and loneliness. I've buried loved ones. I've sat in the dark wondering if the light would ever return. And maybe that makes me just like you. Just human." Daniel froze. The words hit him harder than a punch. For the first time, he felt shame, not because he had insulted a celebrity, but because he realized he had been projecting his own pain onto someone who carried his own. And for the rest of the flight, Daniel couldn't speak. The landing, when the plane finally touched down, Daniel expected Keanu to rush off, maybe with security or assistance. Instead, Keanu stood, helped an elderly passenger with her luggage, and waited patiently for others to exit before him. As Daniel grabbed his briefcase, their eyes met one last time. Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Sometimes the pain we feel is a teacher. Don't silence it. Listen to it. It may be pointing you toward healing." Daniel didn't know why, but his throat tightened, his chest heavy with unspoken emotions. He wanted to argue, to dismiss it as another piece of Zen nonsense, but deep down, he knew those words carried truth. And that night, when sleep finally came, Daniel would discover just how true they were. Because in his dream, a figure far greater than Keanu would appear, and the real journey would begin. The dream of pain. A sleepless night. The city lights outside Daniel's penthouse flickered faintly against the glass as he lay awake in his oversized bed. The soft hum of traffic below, the expensive sheets wrapped around him, the silence of a home filled with luxury. All of it felt hollow. He replayed the flight in his head over and over. Keanu's words echoed like a bell he couldn't silence. "Sometimes the pain we feel is a teacher. Don't silence it. Listen to it," Daniel scoffed at himself. Why do I even care what that actor said? But no matter how much he tried to push it away, the memory clung to him. Finally, exhaustion overtook him and his eyes closed. That's when the dream began. The Valley of Shadows. Daniel found himself standing in a barren valley. The ground cracked like dry clay beneath his feet. The sky was dim, painted in hues of gray and crimson as though the world had been drained of life. A heavy mist curled around him, chilling his skin. In the distance he heard whispers, familiar voices from his past. His father's sharp criticisms, his ex-wife's bitter accusations, his own voice mocking himself during his worst failures. Each word struck him like an arrow, reopening wounds he thought he had buried under money, success, and pride. He stumbled forward, clutching his chest. The whispers grew louder until they became screams echoing through the valley. Suddenly he fell to his knees. Tears burned his eyes and he cried out, "Why does it hurt so much? I've done everything I was supposed to, worked hard, built wealth, won respect. Why does the pain never leave?" The light in the darkness, from the mist a soft light began to glow. It was faint at first, like the flame of a candle, but it grew steadily, illuminating the valley until the shadows retreated. Daniel shielded his eyes, trembling. Out of the light stepped a figure. Not a celebrity, not a businessman, not anyone he expected. It was Jesus. His presence was not thunderous or commanding, but gentle, filled with compassion. His eyes held the depth of eternity, yet they looked at Daniel as though he were the only soul in existence. "Daniel," Jesus said softly, "why are you carrying this pain alone?" Daniel's breath caught. He stammered, because no one else will. Because if I stop fighting, I'll fall apart. Because the world doesn't care about weakness." Jesus knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your pain still hurts because you have never faced it. You've only buried it. You've let it define you, but you've never let it heal you." The wounds revealed as Jesus spoke. Daniel's body began to glow faintly, and suddenly, scars appeared across his skin, marks that represented his inner wounds. He saw the scar of his father's absence, the deep gash of betrayal from his ex-wife, the cracks of failures he had hidden under arrogance. Each scar pulsed with pain. Daniel cried out, "I don't want this. I don't want to feel this anymore." Jesus looked at him gently. "But pain is not your enemy, Daniel. Pain is a messenger. It tells you where the healing must begin. To ignore it is to ignore the path back to yourself." Daniel shook his head, sobbing. "I don't know how. I don't know how to heal." The mirror of truth. Jesus raised his hand, and suddenly a mirror appeared before Daniel. At first he saw his own reflection, cold, prideful, sharp-eyed, wearing the mask of success. But as he looked closer, the image shifted. He saw himself as a boy, innocent, hopeful, desperate for love. He saw a young man standing in the rain after his first heartbreak, pretending he was fine. He saw himself at his wedding, smiling outwardly but doubting inside. He saw the lonely nights at his office, staring at spreadsheets, convincing himself that numbers could replace meaning. Tears streamed down his face. "That's me," he whispered. "That's really me," Jesus nodded. "And I have been with you through all of it. But you never let yourself believe you were worthy of love, so you built walls instead of bridges. You chose pride instead of vulnerability. That is why your pain still hurts. It has never been given the chance to heal in the light of truth." The lesson of the wound, Daniel fell to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. "Then why? Why did you let me go through all of that? Why didn't you stop it?" Jesus' expression did not harden. It softened even more. "Because love is not control. Pain was never meant to destroy you, Daniel. It was meant to shape you. Every wound could have been the place where compassion was born, where humility grew, where kindness flowed. But you chose to cover them with anger instead of letting them teach you." Daniel's sobs slowed. His chest heaved as he realized the truth in those words. A gentle invitation. Jesus extended his hand. "You can still choose differently. You can let the pain become your teacher, not your prison. You can let love heal what pride has buried. The question is, are you willing?" Daniel hesitated. His instinct screamed to hold on to the only armor he knew, his arrogance, his sharp tongue, his endless pursuit of control. But something deeper, something long buried, whispered, "Let go." With trembling hands, Daniel reached out and placed his hand in Jesus. Immediately, warmth surged through him. The scars on his body glowed and began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but transforming. Each scar now shimmered like gold, as though the wounds themselves had become sources of light. Daniel gasped, tears streaming down his face. Jesus smiled. "Your scars do not define your weakness. They are proof that you survived, and in time, they will become the reason you can help others survive too." Awakening. The valley began to fade, the light growing brighter until it engulfed everything. Daniel felt himself being lifted, weightless, free. And then he woke up. He sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The city lights still flickered outside, but something inside him had shifted. The bitterness, the pride, the endless anger. It hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like an unmovable prison. For the first time in years, he felt possibility. He whispered into the darkness. Was that real? And though the room was silent, he felt the echo of the dream within his soul. Pain is a teacher. Listen, and you will find healing. A new beginning. The next morning, Daniel didn't reach for his phone first thing. Instead, he sat quietly by the window, watching the sunrise. For the first time in years, he noticed its beauty. The way the light broke through the horizon. The promise of a new day. And though he didn't fully understand what had happened, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life would never be the same again. Keanu's kindness revealed the day after the dream. When Daniel walked into his office the next morning, he felt different. The polished glass windows, the buzzing phones, the click of keyboards, All the usual signs of corporate life seemed muted. His assistant handed him files, his phone buzzed with messages, but Daniel wasn't as reactive. Something about the dream still clung to him. The words of Jesus echoed in his chest. Your scars do not define your weakness. They are proof that you survived. He wanted to bury the memory, but instead he found himself strangely curious. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing into deals or shouting at subordinates. Instead, he sat back in his chair, staring at the city skyline, thinking about Keanu Reeves. Why had Keanu's words on the flight pierced him so deeply? Why had his humility, his calmness, his kindness struck such a chord? A chance encounter later that week, fate had a way of answering him. Daniel had been invited to a private charity gala in Los Angeles, a gathering of the wealthy, where donations were as much about image as they were about goodwill. Normally, Daniel attended these events to network, to show off, to prove he belonged among the elite. But this time, he was quieter, more observant. He noticed the artificial smiles, the shallow conversations, the desperate need to be seen. It all felt emptier than usual. And then, across the room, he saw him, Keanu Reeves, not surrounded by fans, not basking in attention. He was standing by the corner of the hall, speaking softly with a group of children who had been invited through a cancer foundation. He wasn't posing for photos, he wasn't making grand speeches. He was simply kneeling down to their level, listening to their stories, making them laugh. Daniel froze. This was not the glamorous celebrity he had expected. This was something else. The first step of curiosity, when the gala's host announced that Keanu would be making a small contribution to the evening, Daniel expected some dramatic reveal, maybe a massive check waved around for publicity. Instead, Keanu walked to the podium quietly and said in his soft, unassuming voice, I don't have much to say. I just know what it feels like to hurt. And I know what it means when someone shows you kindness in that moment. Tonight, I just want to help give that gift to others. He placed a donation envelope on the table, not with fanfare, but with sincerity. The applause was polite, but Daniel noticed something striking. Keanu didn't care whether people clapped or not. He wasn't performing. He was giving. Something stirred in Daniel's chest. A question he couldn't shake. Why is he like this? The research that night, Daniel couldn't sleep again. He opened his laptop and, for the first time, searched not for stock reports or business rivals, but for the life story of Keanu Reeves. The articles shocked him. He read about Keanu's father leaving when he was just a child, about the struggles of moving across countries, about his battles with dyslexia that made school difficult. He read about how his best friend had died young, how his partner Jennifer had lost their baby, how she herself later passed away in a tragic accident. He read about his sister's battle with leukemia, and how Keanu quietly donated millions to cancer research without seeking recognition. Each story chipped away at the wall Daniel had built around his own pain. He had thought he was unique in his suffering, that no one could understand the weight he carried. Yet here was a man who had faced storm after storm, tragedy after tragedy, and instead of growing bitter, he had chosen kindness. Daniel sat back in his chair, stunned. All this time I thought he was pretending, but maybe he's the realest person I've ever met. A meeting in silence weeks later, Daniel's company was invited to sponsor another charity event, a fundraiser for children's hospitals. He attended reluctantly, still unsure if his place was among such performative generosity. But once again, there was Keanu, not at the center of attention, not walking the red carpet but sitting quietly at a table, speaking to a nurse about her patients. This time Daniel didn't insult him. He didn't scoff. He simply approached slowly, nervously, and said, Mr. Reeves, we met on a flight a while ago. Keanu turned and recognition flickered in his eyes. He smiled, not the smile of someone who remembered an insult, but the smile of someone who remembered a human being. Daniel, he said warmly. Good to see you again. Daniel swallowed. I wanted to apologize for the way I spoke to you on that flight. I was out of line. Keanu shook his head gently. No need. Sometimes people carry heavy things and they spill over. I understood. Daniel was speechless. How could this man whom he had mocked so harshly respond with such grace? The quiet conversation. Later that evening, they found themselves sitting together at the edge of the hall, away from the noise. Daniel finally asked the question that had haunted him. How do you do it? How do you stay kind? After everything you've been through, after all the loss, I don't understand how you can be so calm, so compassionate. Keanu leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. Pain can do two things. It can harden you or it can soften you. I've known enough of it to realize I don't want to spread more of it around. If I can ease someone else's burden even just a little, then maybe my own pain finds meaning. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of his dream, of Jesus telling him pain was a teacher. He thought of his scars, of how he had used them as excuses for arrogance rather than bridges of compassion. Doesn't it hurt? Daniel whispered. Of course it does, Keanu replied. But hurt doesn't have to make you cruel. Sometimes the deepest pain opens the deepest wells of empathy. The turning point for the first time in his adult life, Daniel felt something stir inside him that wasn't anger, wasn't pride, wasn't bitterness. It was hope. Maybe pain didn't have to be his prison. Maybe it could be the beginning of something else. As the evening ended, Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, just as he had done on the flight. Remember, Daniel, your pain doesn't make you less. It can make you more if you let it. And as Daniel walked out into the cool night air, he realized he was no longer the same man who had boarded that plane weeks ago. Confronting the ego, the cracks in the armor, Daniel Mercer had built his entire life like a fortress. Every achievement was another stone in the wall, every luxury another tower rising above the world. From the outside, he looked untouchable, a successful businessman, a man who commanded respect, a man who had it all. But cracks were forming. Since his dream and his encounters with Keanu, Daniel could no longer look at his fortress the same way. Where once he saw strength, now he saw loneliness. Where once he saw pride, now he saw fear. He found himself staring at his reflection more often, not just in mirrors but in glass windows, in the shine of polished tables. And every time he felt the same haunting question echoing within him, who am I really? Old habits. Die hard, despite his awakening, Daniel wasn't free yet. At the office, his temper still flared when deals didn't go his way. He still snapped at employees, still belittled competitors, still guarded his image like a crown jewel. The ego wasn't willing to let go easily. It clawed at him, whispering in his ear, "If you soften, they'll crush you. If you forgive, they'll laugh at you. If you show weakness, you'll lose everything." At night, those whispers became louder. His dream of Jesus had planted seeds of truth, but his ego fought to choke them out. He wrestled with himself, torn between the man he had always been and the man he could become. The conversation with Keanu one evening, unable to silence his thoughts, Daniel reached out. He remembered the calm in Keanu's eyes, the way he carried pain without letting it poison him. Through a mutual contact from the charity gala, Daniel asked if he could meet him privately. To his surprise, Keanu agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the cameras, far from the noise of Hollywood. Keanu arrived on a motorcycle, helmet tucked under his arm, dressed simply as always. No entourage. No performance. Just himself. As they sat down, Daniel admitted, "I don't understand myself anymore. Part of me wants to change. But part of me is terrified. My whole life has been about control, power, success. If I let go of that, who am I?" Keanu stirred his tea slowly before replying. "That fear you feel, that's your ego fighting for its life. It doesn't want to die, but maybe it's not about killing it. Maybe it's about learning to stop letting it be the only voice you listen to." Daniel frowned. "Easier said than done," Keanu nodded. "Of course. It's a fight. Every day, I've lost battles to my own ego too. But I've learned one thing. Ego thrives in isolation. It tells you you're alone, that you're the only one who matters. But when you start seeing others, really seeing them, ego loses its power." The mirror test that night. Daniel tried something different. He stood before his mirror and forced himself to speak honestly. "I am not invincible," he whispered. "I am not better than anyone else. I am scared." The words tasted bitter, as though admitting them was betrayal. But as he said them, something loosened inside. Tears came uninvited, hot and sharp. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry, not for what he lost. Not for what others had done to him, but for the man he had become. The man who had hurt others because he was too afraid to be vulnerable. The ego screamed inside him, mocking. "Look at you, pathetic. Weak. No one will respect you now. But another voice, softer, echoed from his dream. Your scars do not define your weakness. They are proof that you survived. The encounter with the past a week later, Daniel visited his mother for the first time in months. She was older now, her hands frail, her memory fading in places. Normally, Daniel's visits were short, transactional, paying for her bills, asking about her health, then rushing back to his world of deals and deadlines. But this time, he stayed longer. He asked her about his childhood, about his father, about the moments he had long buried. His mother's eyes filled with tears. You were always so serious, even as a little boy. Always trying to be strong. I used to worry that you didn't know it was okay to cry. Those words broke him. His mother had seen his prison long before he had. He held her hand and whispered, I'm trying. Mom, I'm trying to change. The battle within change didn't come overnight. Some days Daniel felt lighter, freer, smiling at strangers, thanking employees, even forgiving mistakes that once would have enraged him. Other days his ego roared back with a vengeance, pushing him to snap, to belittle, to hide behind arrogance. But now, every time he slipped, he felt it. The sting of awareness, the shame of knowing better, the memory of Keanu's calmness, the vision of Jesus in his dream, and slowly the balance began to shift. His ego was no longer the unquestioned ruler, a small act of kindness. One morning, as Daniel walked into his office building, he saw a janitor struggling to carry a heavy cart of supplies. Normally, Daniel would have walked past without a thought. But something in him stirred. He stopped, stepped forward, and said, Here, let me help you. The janitor looked stunned. Sir, you don't have to. I want to, Daniel said, and together they pushed the cart down the hall. It was such a small act, almost laughably insignificant compared to the deals he was used to making. But when the janitor smiled with genuine gratitude, Daniel felt something shift deep inside. For the first time in years, his chest felt warm, alive, and he realized, maybe this was what Keanu meant. Ego thrives in isolation, but kindness connects. The voice of the ego that night, Daniel dreamed again. Not of Jesus this time, but of his ego. He stood in a dark room, face to face with a shadowy figure that looked exactly like him. Same sharp suit, same cold eyes, same smug smile. Look at you, the shadow sneered. Helping janitors, apologizing to actors, crying in front of mirrors. Do you really think this makes you strong? They'll eat you alive. You're nothing without me, Daniel trembled. For years he had believed that voice. For years he had built his identity around it. But now something inside him resisted. No, he whispered.
I am more than you.
My scars don't make me weak. My pain doesn't make me cruel. I don't need you to survive. The shadow hissed, fading slightly. You'll regret this. But Daniel stood taller. For the first time he didn't cower, and when he woke, sweat dripping down his face, he felt a strange mixture of fear and freedom. The ego wasn't gone, but it was no longer in control. The conversation, the weight of unanswered questions weeks passed, but Daniel couldn't shake the internal storm. He had glimpsed truth in his dream of Jesus. He had witnessed Keanu's quiet kindness. He had felt the cracks in his ego and even stood face to face with its shadow in his sleep. But still, one question haunted him. What now? Change had begun, yes. He was softer with his employees, kinder in small ways, more aware of his pride. But he felt directionless, like a man who had walked out of a burning house only to find himself lost in the woods. It was then he decided he needed to talk to Keanu again. Not in passing, not at a gala, not distracted by crowds or cameras. He needed a real conversation. The meeting place through the same contact as before, Daniel reached out. To his surprise, Keanu didn't hesitate. There's a park I like. Meet me there. It wasn't Beverly Hills nor some private manicured estate. It was a quiet public park tucked away on the edge of the city. Ordinary, overlooked, peaceful. Children played on swings, couples strolled by hand in hand. Old men played chess beneath the shade of oak trees. When Daniel arrived, he found Keanu sitting on a simple wooden bench feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. No one seemed to recognize him, or if they did, they respected his solitude. He blended into the world like any other soul, invisible in his simplicity. Daniel, Keanu greeted, his smile gentle. You came. Daniel sat beside him, exhaling heavily. I wasn't sure I should. I don't want to waste your time. Time spent with another human being, Keanu replied, is never wasted. Breaking the silence. For a while they sat quietly, watching the pigeons flutter and children laugh in the distance. Daniel struggled to begin. Words felt heavy, stuck in his chest. Finally he said, I don't know who I am anymore. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his eyes steady but kind. That's not a bad place to be. Sometimes losing the mask is the first step to finding yourself. Daniel shook his head. But I don't know what's real. My whole life has been about proving something. To my father, to my colleagues, to the world. I thought success would fill the emptiness, but it didn't. And now, I don't know what's left. Keanu's story. Keanu didn't answer right away. He leaned back on the bench, watching the sky through the trees. Then he said softly, You know, I've asked myself the same thing. Daniel frowned. But you're an actor? A celebrity? A man with money and fame? Keanu interrupted gently. Yes, I have those things. But none of them ever filled the emptiness either. None of them brought back the people I loved. None of them erased the nights I sat alone wondering why life hurt so much. Daniel's chest tightened. But you seem so calm. So at peace. Keanu smiled faintly. Peace doesn't mean the pain is gone. It means I've stopped letting it own me. I lost my best friend when I was young. I lost the woman I loved and the child we were expecting. I watched my sister fight cancer for years. I know what it means to ache so deeply you wonder if you'll ever stand again. But in all that pain I learned something. If I let my ego rule me, I'd become bitter. If I let my heart open, I could turn that pain into compassion. And compassion heals more than pride ever could. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. So you're saying pain is useful? Keanu looked at him, his eyes steady. Pain is a fire. It can burn you to ashes, or it can forge you into something stronger. The choice is yours. The hard truth. Daniel stared at the ground. But I don't know if I can change. I've lived this way too long. Keanu turned toward him fully now. You already are changing. Do you think the man who insulted me on that plane would be sitting here now, asking these questions? You've taken steps most people never take. You've looked at your own reflection without running away. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. It doesn't feel like enough. Keanu's voice grew firmer, though still gentle. Daniel, change isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming honest. You'll stumble. You'll hear the voice of your ego again. But each time you choose kindness over cruelty, humility over pride, honesty over pretense, you're winning. The silence that spoke. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was grounding like soil after rain. Daniel felt something inside him settle, as if a weight he had carried for decades had shifted even slightly. Finally, he asked, Do you ever stop missing them? The people you lost? Keanu's eyes grew distant. No, you don't stop missing. But you learn to carry it differently. And sometimes when you give love to someone else, it feels like they're still with you, living through you. That's why kindness matters. It keeps their light alive. Daniel closed his eyes, letting those words sink into his bones. The gift of perspective. As the sun dipped lower, Keanu stood, brushing crumbs from his hands. Daniel, can I tell you something? Anything, Daniel said. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, the same gesture he had given him on the flight. Don't waste your pain. Don't bury it, don't drown in it, don't weaponize it. Transform it. Let it teach you. Let it open you. And when you're ready, use it to heal others. That's when pain becomes purpose. Daniel's eyes stung. He wanted to reply, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, holding on to the moment as if it were a lifeline. Keanu smiled gently. You're not alone, Daniel. None of us are. Remember that. And with that, he picked up his helmet, mounted his motorcycle, and rode away, leaving Daniel on the bench, changed, quiet, and strangely hopeful. The echo within. That night, Daniel didn't dream of shadows. He didn't hear the mocking voice of his ego. Instead, he dreamed of light, gentle, warm, guiding. He dreamed of Jesus' hand still holding his and of Keanu's words echoing in the wind. Don't waste your pain. Transform it. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel didn't dread the morning. He welcomed it because now he finally knew what now meant. Transformation, the dawn of a new chapter. The morning after his conversation with Keanu, Daniel woke up before his alarm. For years he had dreaded mornings, rising with a scowl, rushing into his day like a soldier marching into battle. But this time something felt different. He sat by the window of his penthouse, coffee in hand, and watched the sunrise. For once he wasn't thinking about markets or mergers. He was simply present. The warmth of the sun against his face reminded him of the dream, the valley, the scars, the hand of Jesus reaching for him. For the first time in decades, Daniel didn't feel like he had to conquer the day. He felt like he was being invited to live it, the test of old patterns, but change is never without resistance. That same day at the office, a deal began to unravel. An employee had made an error, costly, embarrassing. The old Daniel would have erupted in fury, tearing the poor employee down to make an example of him. His ego whispered, "Don't let them see weakness. Show them who's in charge." Daniel felt the anger rising, his jaw tightening. But then he remembered Keanu's words. Each time you choose kindness over cruelty, humility over pride, you're winning. He took a deep breath. Instead of yelling, he called the employee into his office, closed the door, and said calmly, "I know you made a mistake, but everyone does. Let's figure out how to fix it together." The employee's eyes widened in shock. His shoulders dropped, his voice cracked with relief as he thanked Daniel. For Daniel, it was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was proof that he could choose differently. Rediscovering connection, in the weeks that followed, Daniel began to change the way he moved through the world. At work, he greeted people by name, not just executives, but receptionists, janitors, assistants. He asked how they were doing, and for the first time, he actually listened. He noticed their smiles, their gratitude, their surprise that the once arrogant boss had begun to act human. At home, he began calling his mother regularly, not just to check bills or logistics, but to talk, to listen to her stories, to thank her for raising him, to tell her he loved her. The first time he said it, her voice broke with tears. He even reconnected with an old friend he had pushed away years ago after a business rivalry. He sent a message, simple and direct. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I was wrong." To his surprise, his friend replied within hours, "I've been waiting years to hear that. Let's catch up." Small acts, big shifts. Daniel began to notice opportunities for kindness everywhere. One afternoon, he was at a cafe when he saw a young woman struggling to pay for her meal after realizing she had forgotten her wallet. The old Daniel would have ignored her, but this time he quietly paid the bill without drawing attention. When she found out, she looked at him with teary eyes. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he smiled faintly. "Because once someone reminded me that kindness matters." Her gratitude stayed with him the rest of the day. Another time, Daniel saw a homeless man outside his office building. Normally, he would have walked past without a glance. But now he stopped, bought the man a sandwich and coffee, and sat down beside him. They talked for nearly half an hour, about life, about loss, about hope. For the first time, Daniel realized how much wisdom lived in places he had never cared to look. The echo of the dream at night. The dreams returned, but they were different now. The valley was no longer barren. Grass began to grow where there had once been only cracked earth. The mist lifted, replaced by beams of light. The voices of accusation grew quieter, and instead of falling to his knees in despair, Daniel found himself walking forward, stronger, freer. In one dream, Jesus appeared again. His smile was radiant, his presence warm. "You've begun to listen, Daniel," he said. "Now let your actions speak louder than your fears." Daniel woke with tears in his eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude. A chance to give back months. Later, Daniel received an invitation from the same charity foundation where he had first seen Keanu with the children. This time, instead of showing up to network or make himself look good, Daniel felt a pull in his heart. He wanted to give, not for recognition, but for purpose. He donated quietly without announcements. But more importantly, he volunteered his time. He began spending Saturdays at the children's hospital, reading to kids, bringing games, simply sitting with them. At first, he felt awkward. What did a businessman know about comforting sick children? But slowly, he realized, it wasn't about knowing. It was about showing up. One little boy with leukemia clung to him every week, calling him Uncle Dan. When the boy asked if he could visit again, Daniel felt his chest ache, but this time it was the ache of love, not emptiness. Keanu returns. At one of those hospital visits, Daniel was surprised to see Keanu again. He had come quietly just as before, bringing books and small gifts for the kids. When their eyes met, Keanu smiled knowingly. "You found your way here." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Because of you. Because of what you showed me." Keanu shook his head. "Not because of me. Because you chose to listen. You chose to change." For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. He simply reached out and Keanu clasped his hand firmly. Two men, one a celebrity, one a businessman, connected not by fame or wealth but by the shared truth of suffering, transformed into compassion. The new man, over time, people began to notice. Daniel's employees whispered about how he wasn't the same. His rivals raised eyebrows at his calmer, humbler demeanor. His mother told him she was proud, but Daniel didn't care about their opinions anymore. For the first time in his life, he wasn't living for validation. He was living for meaning. He realized something profound. Success without kindness was empty. Wealth without compassion was poverty of the soul. And pride without humility was just another prison. He wasn't perfect, far from it. He still stumbled, still wrestled with his ego, still had days when old habits reared their heads. But now he had something he had never had before. Awareness, purpose, hope. The transformation complete one evening. As he left the hospital after another volunteer shift, Daniel stood under the night sky, gazing at the stars. He remembered his first encounter with Keanu on that plane, the insults he had hurled, the bitterness that had poisoned him. He remembered the dream of Jesus, the valley of scars, the hand that reached for him. He remembered the battles with his ego, the conversations that changed him, the acts of kindness that rebuilt him. And he whispered into the quiet night, "Thank you for not giving up on me." For the first time in decades, Daniel felt whole. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally learned how to transform it. Legacy: the ripple of kindness. Years had passed since that first-class flight where Daniel Mercer, bitter and arrogant, had insulted Keanu Reeves. Years since the dream where Jesus had revealed the truth about his pain. Years since the long nights of wrestling with his ego. The man who once lived for wealth, pride, and appearances was gone. In his place stood someone new. Not perfect, not flawless, but transformed. Daniel discovered that kindness was not just an act, but a force. Every small gesture rippled outward in ways he could never predict. The janitor he once helped became a friend who shared wisdom about perseverance. The employee he forgave grew into one of the company's most loyal managers, inspired by his compassion. The homeless man he sat with spread word of his humanity, breaking down the image of a cold businessman. And the little boy at the hospital, the one who called him Uncle Dan, became his anchor. Through that child's laughter, Daniel found joy he had long forgotten. Through that child's battles, he found courage. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. And that made all the difference. A speech without pride. One evening, Daniel was invited to speak at a charity gala. Not to boast about his business empire, but to share his story. The room was filled with donors, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. The old Daniel would have strutted onto the stage, flashing wealth and dominance. The new Daniel walked humbly, pausing at the podium, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of honesty. He began quietly. "I used to think success was about power, about proving yourself, about being the loudest in the room. But I was wrong. Success without kindness is empty. Wealth without compassion is poverty of the soul. Pain without purpose is just suffering." It took me years and some very humbling lessons to understand this. I learned it from strangers. I learned it from my faith. I learned it from children who have more courage in their little bodies than I had in my entire career. My pain didn't disappear. But I discovered something. Pain can be transformed. It can become the fire that forges you into someone better. If you let it, pain can make you softer, kinder, stronger. The room was silent. No applause yet, just the stillness of hearts being moved. Then slowly hands began to clap. First a few, then the entire hall, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. Daniel smiled, tears in his eyes. This was not applause for his ego. This was connection, soul to soul. The return of the dream. That night, Daniel dreamed once more. He stood again in the valley, but it was no longer barren. Flowers bloomed across the soil, streams of water flowed where cracks once lay, and children laughed in the distance. Jesus appeared, radiant as before, his presence filled with warmth. You've done well, Daniel, he said. Not because you became perfect, but because you allowed yourself to be changed. You listened. You loved, and that is what I asked of you. Daniel bowed his head, tears streaming. I still stumble. I still fail, Jesus smiled. And yet you keep walking. That is faith. That is courage. The dream faded, but Daniel woke with peace unlike any he had ever known. A final encounter. Months later, Daniel crossed paths with Keanu once more. It was at another children's hospital fundraiser. Keanu was sitting quietly with a young girl, helping her braid a bracelet. When Daniel approached, Keanu looked up and grinned. Still at it, huh? Daniel chuckled. Still trying, and still hearing your words in my head. Keanu shook his head. Not my words, just truths you were ready to hear. They shared a moment of silence, two men scarred by life but bound by compassion. Then Keanu leaned in slightly and said, You know, legacy isn't about what you leave behind in buildings or bank accounts. It's about the lives you touched, the people you loved, and the kindness that keeps living after you're gone. Daniel felt the words settle deep within him. He realized then, this was what his life was about now. Not domination, not pride, but legacy, the kind built on love. The ripple lives on in the years that followed. Daniel poured himself into causes greater than himself. He established scholarships for underprivileged youth, funded programs for children battling illness, and transformed his company culture into one rooted in empathy and respect. But more importantly, he lived differently every single day. He called his mother every evening until her final breath, whispering, I love you, so often she never doubted it. He rekindled friendships he thought were lost forever. He mentored young entrepreneurs, not just in business, but in life, teaching them that compassion was as important as strategy. When asked about his transformation, Daniel always said the same thing. I met a man on a plane. I insulted him, and instead of fighting back, he showed me kindness. That was the beginning. The circle complete years later, when Daniel himself grew older. Frailer, his body slowing down, he often sat by the window, watching the sunrise as he had on that first morning of change. One morning, as he closed his eyes, he felt a strange peace wash over him. He saw once again the valley of his dreams, now fully alive with beauty. Jesus stood there, extending his hand, and this time Daniel walked forward without hesitation. Beside him stood faces Daniel had once lost, his father, smiling softly, his friends, the little boy from the hospital, healthy and laughing, and standing a little further back, quietly smiling, was Keanu, nodding in approval. Daniel understood then, legacies are not measured in years but in love, and his had just begun. The lesson for us, Daniel's story reminds us that no matter how deep our wounds, no matter how strong our pride, no matter how long we've lived in bitterness, change is always possible. Pain does not have to destroy us. It can become the fire that shapes us. Kindness is not weakness, it is strength. Humility is not defeat, it is freedom. And legacy is not about what we own, it is about what we give.